What I did, though, is to just set out to understand my own experience. And this is a little bit the way that I'm wired. Like every time I go through something, I'm like, well, at least that would make a good article. And so I just try to write my way through that. And that's what I did with burnout, just try to write my way through what that experience was and reach out to others and talk to folks in different communities and different churches that had also experienced some burnout. And I've got a piece that's going to come out with Christian Century. They keep threatening me, saying it's going to come out in Lent, but I'm like, this is really important, so maybe we can get them to publish it sooner, who knows. But I prayed and read and I wrote my way through this, and I talked to 7 pastors and leaders and one pastor's spouse in a variety of traditions: Baptist, Methodist, non-denominational, evangelical, Mennonite was in there. It's not a longitudinal study or anything, but for me it was a way to try to get some texture, add some texture to the conversation and get a feel for what's happening. And there are folks in Wyoming and Colorado and Michigan and Massachusetts, North Carolina, and Kansas. So just, collected tender stories. It takes it's sort of a funny thing to reach out to people and be like, do you know anyone who's burned out, right? And then everybody raises their hand. But and I know burnout is like the malady of our age. It's kind of a trendy topic right now. I mean, as one writer analyzed, burnout fits perfectly with our work-centric culture. It's this sort of, in one way, the histrionics of everything, right? It's an epidemic of burnout. It's a crisis of burnout. Everybody is burned out. Like all the pastors are quitting. The millennials are all burned out. I mean, there's a teacher shortage. All the doctors are going home to write children's books instead. It's the great resignation, right? And you see those big numbers, the Barna study that says that 38% of mainline pastors are thinking about quitting. But on the other hand, it's like handy for there to be an epidemic or a crisis, because then people can take that crisis and blame it on their theory of what's wrong with the world and provide their preferred solution to it. And in a sense, maybe that is just exactly what I'm doing here. But I'm convinced that burnout plays out in a distinctive way, or distinctive ways, in the unique contours of rural, and that burnout among pastors and leaders in the church has a spiritual dimension. And I think that recovering from burnout in rural ministry really is going to require a reorientation toward God, in which we don't just do ministry, but we receive it as grace. Now, what exactly is burnout? It can be kind of hard to pin down. Burnout is related to depression, which, if you have experience with depression, it's kind of equally mysterious in some ways. But usually depression is understood to have psychological or physiological components, whereas burnout is specifically related to work. And so if you get away from the work, if you take a sabbatical, the burnout clears up. Whereas that would not happen with depression. And I don't think we can blame everything on the pandemic, right? You're probably just as tired of hearing that it was the pandemic, right? But if anything, I think the pandemic kind of sped up and revealed some of the tensions that were already there and the transformation that's really been underway for decades. I think something deeper than the pandemic is going on. Now, the World Health Organization defines burnout as an occupational phenomenon that is characterized by feelings of energy depletion or exhaustion, increased mental distance from one's job, or feelings of negativism or cynicism related to one's job, and reduced professional efficacy. And so people who are experiencing burnout doubt that their work matters, and they disconnect from it. Sorry, I've got some allergy stuff going on. So it's tiredness. The work just isn't the same anymore. You don't want to do it. You feel like you can't do it. You don't have any energy to do it, which is pretty much like what I feel every Saturday afternoon as I'm trying to put the finishing touches on that sermon. But pastors that I interviewed, they talked about feeling fatigued. They said that the well was dry. One pastor that I talked to described how there was a point in his life when he was feeling burned out, and he was so fried that he went to his elder board and he pounded his fist. He said, "I need a sabbatical." And they weren't super impressed by that, though he did get his sabbatical, so I'm not sure what the lesson is there. But The key markers of burnout, are this exhaustion and this cynicism. Now, writer John Malesic, he's got a new book called The End of Burnout, which I can recommend to you. And he talks about how he was living what was supposed to be his dream as a college professor. He had tenure. And then he just found that he could not do the work anymore. He had no more energy for it. He literally could not get out of bed in the morning and make himself go to class and teach. And Malesic defines burnout as the experience of being pulled between expectation and reality at work. So expectation and reality. And I want to phrase that for us in rural ministry. I want to phrase that as the difference between the ideal and the actual. All right, we have an ideal of what we do, and then we have this actual work that can look different. And I think that disconnect is kind of like built into the very fundamentals of ministry, and really all ministry. Richard Lisher, who's got this book, Open Secrets, he's a professor and a writer and a pastor. He says this: one part of the church goes to great expense in order to prepare a theologian for another part of the church that wants a guitar player. And so there's your ideal and your actual. And so, I remember my very first call. We were finishing up seminary in Elkhart, Indiana, and this congregation in eastern Washington state was talking to me about coming out there. And in the job description, it said that I needed to mow the lawn. And I'm not above mowing the lawn, but I was just really skittish about this whole idea of like, what are you looking for exactly? What do you think I'm going to do for you? And I was kind of skittish of like taking my family all the way across the country to be like the church's lawnmower, right? So we had to negotiate that a little bit, the ideal and the actual. And we have this idealized version of ministry. We're called, right? I mean, we're doing kingdom work. We are sent out on God's errand, but then we find ourselves getting tangled up in intergenerational conflict and indifference and meetings, and we discover that the redeemed aren't all that redeemed. And we're idealists, right? I mean, we got in the biz because we are idealists. That is, we want to make a difference, right? Does that sound like you at all? But like, blink once for yes, if that's you, right? But we got into this because we're idealists, and the community just doesn't respond as we think it should, right? A visitor at our church just a couple of weeks ago, he said, he talks to me, he says, with preaching like that, you'd think the congregation would be full, the church would be full. And I go, well, one would think, right? But just people don't respond as maybe you imagine. And we come out of our ministry training with stars in our eyes, and then we discover that the church is this little bit moth-eaten, chintzy thing. It's like Annie Dillard wrote that, a high school stage play is more polished than this service we have been rehearsing since the year one. In 2,000 years, we have not worked out the kinks. And so the ideal and the actual don't always match. And then, as Malesic identifies, in our culture, we derive so much of our sense of dignity and self-worth from work. And so this ideal actual tension gets transmogrified into an identity question for our pastors, because we are the original bring your whole selves to work practitioners, right? Work is vocation, is self. And so when our work gets wobbly, the whole thing shakes. And then, people change churches. They say, well, I'm just not being fed or whatever, right? And it lands not as a rejection of our work or even of our church, but of ourselves. And our work is just so intensely personal, right? Because the soul care that we're doing, it is soul bearing. And we are constantly preaching and teaching from this most deep place, these deeply held values, which is to say from this very intimate, very precious part of ourselves. And, what's more, we live in a society that is at best mystified by what we do as pastors and leaders in the church, and at worst, actively hostile to it. And our work is both abstract and concrete in the worst ways, right? It can feel like we're doing all this administrivia stuff. And then, the church is small in a lot of our rural contexts. Maybe it's shrinking and our work is often undervalued, and we can undervalue it ourselves, right? We've all got like this little Marx who is sitting on our shoulder telling us that the work that we're doing is really just a cover for base power. And it can be hard to shake him. And, for me, when I experienced burnout, it was like entering a desert. My soul was wrung out. My pastor heart was dry after some astringent criticism of my ministry. And I just needed a win, but I found myself wandering in what the Psalms call the trackless wastes. And so what I want to do is describe the desert of rural burnout, and then I want to give a couple of prescriptive possibilities or a few stabs at what we can do. And so I think the desert of rural burnout, it's got its own distinct geography. However we understand rural, one of the defining features of rural is the sparsity of people. And so in the rural church, I think that sparsity can translate into a couple of things: a heavy sense of smallness, of isolation, and FOMO, a fear of missing out. And I don't want to overstate the challenges either, right? Because of course there's just loads of beautiful things about rural. But with caveats, I think those are a few of the challenges that I and others have experienced when we think about rural. So let's just get into that a little bit. So first, smallness. However we talk about rural, it's small, right? And we can talk about the fishbowl effect of being in rural. So as one pastor described to me, everybody walks on eggshells at times. People are watching what you do. They see you. I remember one pastor or one family was telling me how there were some folks across the street who would be like some elderly folks who would watch them and kind of take stock of like if they turned their lights off at the right time, according to them, that sort of thing. Like you're being watched. And I remember we went on a international trip and we got back into town and our phone rang as we're walking in the doors when there used to be landlines. We answered it and somebody goes, "Hey, I heard you're back in town." I'm like, holy cow, like are there cameras or what, right? But, so pastors of small and declining churches, we can feel like we're watched. There's a kind of a pressure that can eat us alive. And then there's also this pressure to make the church grow, and you're trying to do that in this context of smallness. It's an internal pressure from us, our congregations put it on us, and the world puts it on us too. I think there's a sense of isolation often. Rural congregations can be tremendously isolating. Educational opportunities, services, internet access, even peers can be unavailable or far-flung. The denominational office is often a city somewhere. Even just arriving at the church can be this GPS-bending dirt road experience, right? You might be rural if you got lost trying to get to your church at one point when you first came. Add to that the impression among many rural pastors that their values and convictions conspicuously stand at odds with those of the local community, and that sense of isolation is complete. Only the coyotes can hear us cry. And then FOMO. Have you heard this term before? The fear of missing out. The way it gets used a lot of times is with people looking at social media and being like, wow, everybody's going to exotic places and having a party, and I'm just here reading a book. But in the rural church, I think the fear of missing out really manifests itself as like everybody else's church is kind of somewhere over the rainbow, somewhere where miracles are happening and the church is growing and they're doing this really cool social justice-y stuff. And it can sometimes feel like, at the same time, like those churches are really exciting. And then at the same time, like the engines of cultural production and success, like those are located everywhere. And they're no doubt located somewhere that has a downtown and better coffee. And that's where, at least a lot of the attention gets focused, right? And you think like, am I just missing out? Are my gifts being used? Am I doing anything that matters here? And so, if we've got this idea that burnout it arises because of that disconnect between ideal and actual. And I think what most of us do when we experience this sense of like kind of a clash with the work that we're doing. What most of us do is just really dig in on the actual. And we really go to town trying to change our church or change our community. That can have some positive impact because it can be like transformational. We can be transformational leaders or aspire to that. Sometimes it's just literally changing churches, right? We look at the actual, it doesn't live up to our expectations, and we just move, right? Or we get jaded and burn out. And so if there's kind of two pieces to this equation, the ideal and the actual, instead of talking about how do you change the actual and kind of make your church live up to the expectations, I want to think about changing the ideal. And so here's how I want to frame that. For me, like the overarching concept is that we want to have a reorientation toward God, in which we don't just do ministry, but we receive it as grace. And so that reorientation, I think, is learning to love. Jesus' two greatest teachings, or the greatest teaching of the scriptures according to Jesus, the center of Jesus' ministry is love God, love your neighbor, right? And so in one way, like learning to love truly is at the heart of being a disciple. It's what it means to be a Christian. So I think we're learning to love. James K.A. Smith, he has a book called You Are What You Love, right? So what is our end point? What are our loves focused on? What is our desire drawing us to? And so I think about this reorientation towards God as having a hunger for Christ. Desiring God above all things. 1 Corinthians 2:2. Paul says, "For I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified." Or, Hebrews talks about we have no lasting city here, but we are on this pilgrimage toward the city, which what St. Augustine calls the city of God, right? And Augustine wrote that he, that is God, he himself is the source of our bliss. He himself is the goal of our striving. So have a reorientation. What are our desires really oriented toward? I'll get to how we can make that concrete in a moment, but that's like for me the first philosophical concept. And then the second one is receiving our ministry as grace. Like in Ephesians 4, Paul talks about the gifts for ministry, or the gifts that Christ gave. And at least there, they are actually ministries, right? So the apostles, the pastors, the evangelists, and the shepherds, or the shepherds teachers, and the shepherds teachers. And so they're gifts for ministry. And think about also this idea of like what is our hunger for? Paul talks about how power is perfected in weakness, right? My grace is sufficient for you, right? In his ministry. And we're always going to be doing ministry under the sign of the cross. We never really believe that because the sign of the cross doesn't jibe very well with our cultural mythology of the self-made, pull myself up by my bootstraps, I built this, man or woman. And, we admire the entrepreneurs, and rightly so, but even those who have the most apostolic gifts labor under the sign of the cross. And Paul in 1 Corinthians 4, he says, think of us in this way, as servants of Christ and stewards of God's mysteries. And he goes on to say that I don't even judge myself in my ministry, right? I don't have that wherewithal. And so what I'm saying about getting reoriented toward God and receiving our ministry as grace, it's a little bit abstract, but I want to go into some concrete pieces here. And I should just also make a little note that I'm not going to really talk about self-care because I don't think self-care gets us there. Self-care is important, but really just as a baseline. You got to eat right, sleep enough, exercise. That's just like goes without saying. And burnout can happen even when you're doing all of those things. And I think sometimes self-care can become an exercise in distraction, right? That the work is always there. It is all-encompassing in one way. And we do self-care and we realize that the work is waiting for us when we get back. It is not dead, it is just sleeping. And then even after an extended sabbatical, you get back into it and that burnout will start to creep up and breathe down your neck again. Now I get a little bit nervous when things line up too neat and tidy and they kind of form a table, but each of these moves that I want to talk about with you, they more or less align with three dangers, those three dangers that I was talking about earlier. So here are the concrete moves I think we want to pay attention to. This one is against smallness. Realize that your ministry is not your faith. I was talking to somebody recently who described a pastor who he thought really had it together. And he said, she seems like somebody, this pastor, she seems like somebody that at the end of the day, after doing ministry, just shrugs, drinks a shot of whiskey, and goes to bed. And I wouldn't really recommend that because I think, it messes with your sleep cycle. But that idea of like setting it down at the end of the day, kind of distinguishing between who you are and the work that you do. Separate out your ministry and your faith. And our faith is so precious to us. It's something that we will not abandon. It's our own spiritual journey toward and with God. But ministry is a job. Just like, can you say that with me? Ministry is a job. I hope you hear me right on this, but I think we got to hold it a little bit more lightly, right? Like hold lightly our ideal of what ministry is. I think idealized ministry is killing our souls, and so don't idealize it, or at least just hold it a little bit lightly, right? Like give your congregation permission to be human beings, and give yourself permission to be a human being in the middle of that. As Augustine also said, the soul lives by leaving alone that thing it dies pursuing. So stop pursuing idealized ministry and begin to live. But it's really hard to leave that alone, right? How do you set aside idealized visions of ministry? Because the best pastors, like we said earlier, they're all idealists at heart. That we believe this stuff. We're the people that are like really religious, you know what I mean? It's like, and often our ideals are what sustain us when things get kind of rocky, right? I don't know if any of you are Tolkien fans, the whole Lord of the Rings and everything. I love that kind of stuff. But, the Lord of the Rings, like that ring of power, on the one hand, it can be this source of great power for somebody, or at least has that illusion. But on the other hand, it can destroy us. And I think that's a little bit like our idealism, right? Idealism is what gives us umph and verve and creativity. It's what sustains us on the bumps in the road. But then it also, that idealism has the power to like turn us into Gollum, and we're kind of just like over there saying my precious, and but what are we looking for, right? Because I think for a lot of us the ideal, it comes from this sense that of what our faith really is this desire to grow up into Christ. That's part of what I think drew us in, or at least that was my experience. Like it's studying and learning and teaching and preaching and walking with people in the critical moments, right? Those things are exciting to us. They're part of our own spiritual journey. And then, hey, you get a salary too. But our vocational journey, it really is in one way kind of this spiritual quest. But I think burnout happens because we are seeking self-actualization in our work, and there's that ideal between that gap between the ideal and the actual. And I think what we got to do is just rekindle first off, separate it out, but then realize that like the work that is so precious to us, that we want to happen in our own lives, part of what got us into that, like Christ can do that work in the rural church, regardless of the scruffiness of the congregation that we're working with. 2 Peter 1:3, that his divine power has given us everything we need for life and godliness. And that is true of the rural church too. And I think, if that's what we're looking for, then we got to realize that can happen in the smallest, most worn out places, right? Rust Belt or whatever you want to call it. But what I'm getting at is that we got to distinguish between this precious journey that we are on with Christ, that's our faith journey, and then the work that we do for the church. The first is an ideal. Let's hold to that. The second is not. And there's going to be moments, I'm sure you've experienced these, where you will feel very alive, where it just seems like everything comes together and it all clicks. You're teaching the youth and they're getting it and they're responding to the good news and they're like on the edge of their seats. There's those moments where you're like, come Holy Spirit, right? But then there's also those moments where you're teaching the youth and you're trying to get them you're trying to talk over them as they make armpit farts, it's just like, you got to treasure those precious, ideal moments when it all clicks without staking your life and faith on them. And also, I think our ideals, they corrupt us because they ultimately make ministry about us in a way that becomes unhealthy. It's about our accomplishments, our performance, our abilities, and that's just too much weight for our ministries to bear. Like I was saying a little bit yesterday, people will forget that we did the sermon for their loved one, and even though it was a real crackerjack sermon like that, it's just gone to history. But let me grab another cut tissue. I think one of the second concrete move that I think we've got to make is to get rooted in the reality that is deeper and broader than our local ministry. And this one kind of goes against isolation. My conference did a discussion group a number of years ago, and it was basically became like how to survive rural, and they were like getting people together that were in rural ministry to talk, and I remember kind of being annoyed by that, like how that's it. But maybe there's some truth that we need to take that kind of a approach, but from a spiritual angle, the horizons of our rural world, they can sometimes become soul constricting. And I'm not making any kind of a judgment that this is true, but whether it's because of cultural expectations that we bring or the stuff that we were taught in high school at the graduation speech about going out and changing the world or wherever we pick that up, it kind of is what it is. We bring that, we've got this expectation that we're supposed to do big things, and our worldview and expectation and self-expectations, those don't just turn on the dime. It's hard to kind of set some of that ideal down. And remember, I talked yesterday, and we heard it again today in Michelle's talk about Jesus saying in John 15, abide in me. He said, apart from me, you can do nothing. And of course, we do all kinds of things apart from him, but we don't do anything good. And so coming back to this place of being rooted in a reality that's deeper than ourselves, that's going to mean having a discipline of prayer. Fasting doesn't hurt. It means taking seriously that we need times of communion and community. I discovered in my own ministry that I did not have enough communion in my life, and so I started this little living room communion liturgy with some friends, and we celebrate communion once a month and just feast together and talk about life, and that was something that really fed my soul. I think we need to learn to hear the voices of those who love us, not least hear the voice of God speaking to us through the scriptures or just in times of retreat and prayer with him. One pastor that I talked to said that she said you can feel like a failure. You feel like you let God down. And so we got to hear those supportive voices lest we get stuck only hearing the judgments of others. And this is where it's really important to hear the voices of friends and family. So the pastor's spouse that I talked to, who's in Montana, she talked about the importance of hearing the voice of those who love you and hearing the voice of those who can kind of clue you in to what your stressors are. So be rooted in something deeper than that immediate reality. And then I think we got to learn to fail. This kind of goes against the fear of missing out. If the fear of missing out is that others are doing big things elsewhere, then one way we can address that is to just say, well, go do something big where you are. It's Ignatius of Loyola's question where he said, what more can I do for the love of Christ? And he didn't mean like to earn the love of Christ. He meant, how can the love of Christ energize me in a way that I can go on to do something that is of great importance for the kingdom? So what is that in your context? If you're seeing people doing cool stuff like opening the coffee shop, that becomes a place for evangelism, like, well, go open the coffee shop, right? Launch that nonprofit, start that men's ministry, write that book, right? Whatever it is for you, just go give it a try. And part of what we got to do in this is get over our culture's expectations of failure. I think there's maybe good failure and there's bad failure. And I know just like burnout is kind of a trendy word. Failure is also kind of in vogue. The company called X, which was formerly Google X, they have this motto. They say, fail often, fail well. So I think it's, they're trying to get people to attempt big things. They talk about how they bonus people that fail, and they give high fives and hugs to people who fail, right? Because they tried something that was out there, something that was considered impossible. And, I took that kind of approach early on in my ministry, this idea of like fail fast. I was just trying everything, because I got out in this little rural church and realized that I didn't know what to do. And it just felt like nothing was working. I was getting kind of discouraged. And I remember one of my elders came to me, and he's like, he tried to give me some helpful advice. And he said, well, I think people would follow you if they could see some success. And I was like, oof, yeah. And I was like, look, I'm throwing everything at the wall right now, trying to make something stick. I don't even know what to do, and I don't know what success would look like exactly. But, if your community is shrinking because a large employer had left, or maybe the school system closed down, we got to just really acknowledge some of that stuff. Those hurts that our congregations and communities are carrying can really be a collective trauma that they're carrying. But then help them to gently expand the realm of possibility by just staying with them through some of that stuff and telling stories of hope. And then I think conducting experiments, and here's where the idea of like good failure and bad failure comes in, right? You can conduct experiments because you don't fail at experiments. You just get data out of experiments. And if bad failure, maybe that's like moral failure, right? That's failure that destroys our souls or the soul of the congregation or the community. So we want to avoid that. But good failure could be failure where we attempt something new and big for God, failure that opens up an imaginative possibility in a place where it didn't seem possible, whether or not it succeeds by our metrics. And, it is really harder than you think to be able to know if you're being successful. As writer Tim Suttle puts it, in the church, success is above our pay grade. And our sense is just too short to always know what success and failure look like, unless it's moral failure. In some ways, that's kind of just abject and you can see it. But our horizons are always too near to know if we're failing or achieving some success. And I think, a lot of the big names that were held out and held themselves out as stories of success have turned out not to be, like Bill Hybels and Mark Driscoll and Bruxy Cavey and some of these other guys. But, we don't know the horizon, right? You got to see people's lives and ministries and churches over the long term. And I think about sometimes in the immediate, there's a lot of what looks like failure, but that can have tremendous consequences for the kingdom. So do you know the name Adoniram Judson? Have you heard that? Yeah. I just bumped into him a couple of years ago. So he was an American Baptist missionary, Adoniram Judson. In the 1830s, he began to work among the Karen people in Myanmar. And for years, he did not have a single convert, right? He'd been living hard in Burma. Several of his infant children died. His wife died. He got remarried. His second wife died. He was imprisoned under horrific conditions during the Anglo-Burmese War. But then later, Christian faith would catch fire among the Karen people. And his translation of the Bible back in the 1830s, translated into Burmese, it would really become the standard translation. And today, Myanmar, Burma has one of the largest Baptist populations in the world. Well, would Mr. Judson have considered himself a failure in those early years? Would he have thought, I'm pretty sure God doesn't want me here, which is why all these things keep happening to me? I mean, would he have said, I don't think I have the skills to see this project through? I mean, what would you do? I think, would you struggle? Would you stay if you were struggling to learn the language? Would you stay if you had no converts? Would you stay if your infant died, or your spouse died, or your second spouse died? I mean, would you stay if you were imprisoned and hung upside down in chains? I mean, I think I'd be on the next boat to New York, but we just don't have the horizon and the wherewithal to know what is failure and what is success a lot of times. I think we've just got to have the humility to recognize that we don't know where things are going or how they'll turn out. want to close with a Thomas Merton quote. It's a famous prayer of his, and I'll read just a couple of lines. He says this: "I believe that the desire to please you does in fact please you, and I hope that I have that desire in all that I am doing, and I hope that I will never do anything apart from that desire." So do we have time maybe for a little bit of questions? And if we have like 5 minutes, questions, pushback, comments? Yes?
As a layperson, what can I do